Welcome to the very first seed. We're very proud in the School of Geography and the Environment of our research environment. We are truly dynamic and vibrant in terms of research environment, and we now know that for a fact because our research environment statement came top of the recent REF evaluation in geography and was the only one to receive full marks. But we're also not complacent, and at the moment we're outlining our new research strategy within the department. And as part of that, we're trying to find new ways to bring people together and talk about our research and find out what each other's doing. And we ran a couple of research strategy workshops last term, and at the end of one of those, a group of really enthusiastic geographers came up, including Ian Ashpole, Jerome Mayo and Katrin Wilhelm, with this idea of TED-style talks for an afternoon. So they're entirely responsible for it. I take no claim for the credit for this, and it's really due to their huge enthusiasm and organisation that we're all here this afternoon. So we're going to be hearing 16 rather, if only I could count, that'd be even better, 16 talks this afternoon in 8 groups, reflecting the different research centres of the department and the different research clusters. And they're all going to give us a flavour of what our research is about. And geography really, in research terms, is like an octopus. Its tentacles spread out throughout the academic landscape and the policy landscape and really cover all sorts of different things, as we're going to find out this afternoon. So how we're going to run this, they're like TED Talks, they'll be short, punchy, interesting talks, and after each one I will give a very short little bit of waffle while they change over the microphones for the next speaker. At the end there will be food, drinks and chat in the Herbertson room. So let's get started. We're going to have a couple of talks now from the Ecosystems group, and let's welcome Yadvinder Mali first of all.
Thanks, Heather. And I'll give a very quick overview of the biodiversity, ecosystems and conservation cluster before moving on to Ali to give the awesome visuals. This cluster covers a whole range of work around the biosphere, not only the natural science of the biosphere, but also its social science, its consideration as a social ecological system, and also its governance. And we're quite a large cluster overall, around 8 teaching faculty and fellows, 18 postdoctoral researchers working within this cluster, and our latest count around 24 DPhil research students. And just to give you a very broad overview of some of the key people that have groups and components within the cluster. On one level, we have a conservation biogeography and macroecology group with Rob Whittaker and Paul Jepson, who also directs one of the MSCs, and Rich Grenier, who's the academic director of the Biodiversity and Conservation and Management MSc, and their work focuses on questions on the nature of diversity at the scale of the planet, but also how that information and the information from biogeography feeds into conservation decision making and conservation planning. Another component of this cluster looks at different ecosystems. My own work focuses on tropical ecosystems in particular and the functioning of tropical forests and how they're responding to climate change and monitoring the systems over change. Chris Doughty, a departmental research lecturer, focuses on ecosystems as well, but also has a particular interest in megafauna, both contemporary and past megafauna, and how they affect the functioning of the biosphere. And a new addition, Mark Macias-Fauria, who's just started as a NERC fellow and an associate professor, and he has a particular focus on cold ecosystems, either polar or high elevation systems, and how they are responding to climate change. And the third component of this group is the focus that we have on governance, and Pam Berry focuses on climate change adaptation and ecosystem services with her group. Tom Thornton leads research on indigenous peoples, cultural diversity and their relationships to the environment, and Connie McDermott leads the forest governance group. So all looking at different aspects of governance, and certainly Paul Jepson's conservation governance laboratory also fits within this subsection as well. So that gives you a quick overview, and I'll hand over to Ali to talk about lasers in the jungle.
Now, Yadvinder gave Ali Schenkin a big build-up in his talk just now, saying that Ali was going to take us to look at lasers in the jungle, and we were going to be faced with amazing visuals. So I hope that Ali is really going to fulfill that promise and take us and show us something visually attractive, as well, obviously, as himself being very visually effective.
So I'm good. I'm Ali Schenkin. I'm at the ecosystems group here. And I'm going to talk to you about the work we're doing in tropical ecosystems to understand forest function, structure, and how we use some new tools to shed light on some old questions. Traditionally, we've measured forest structure by getting on the ground and using tape measures or clinometers to measure the size of trees, the heights of trees. And we've come up with graphs to understand how these forest structures change across ecosystems. Or if we want more of a gestalt view of the forest, we'll draw forest profile diagrams to understand how forests look. And these are quite valuable to really get a sense of how these forests work. So even though this is recent, technology has moved on, and new technology ends up providing, I guess these ones didn't get changed, ends up providing a very nice complement to these more traditional tools. So what you see here is an instrument that's shooting lasers, and it shoots lasers down. This is called a LiDAR. It shoots lasers, and these are literally lasers in the jungle. You get a pulse back, and so you know how distant an object is by measuring the time of return of your laser. So this is just on the ground. You can imagine with vegetation, as the laser goes through, you get various returns as a laser goes through a tree, and you get a sense of where the vegetation is along this line. And you can imagine if you do this millions and millions of times, you'll end up with a 3D picture of a forest, which I'll show you in a little bit. We team up with Greg Asner in the Carnegie Airborne Observatory for our airborne LiDAR systems, and he has a LiDAR along with some hyperspectral instruments in here. And we've also teamed up with a group of researchers at Wageningen University. I worked on that pronunciation. And this operates on the same principle as the airborne LiDAR, except that it's terrestrial. It's on the ground, and this thing spins around, shoots lasers around millions of times, gives a much better sense of what the understory of a forest looks like. So this is our laboratory. This is the Cosnipata Valley from the cloud forests in Peru all the way down to the lowland of the Amazon. I'm going to take you on a brief tour of these plots. This is our first one called Waikecha. And we're flying in. This is terrestrial LiDAR data. And we fly in, and you can see that these crowns are maybe 18 meters tall. You get a sense as you see this blue underneath that you actually have quite rich data that come from these forests. If we go around the corner to our next plot in Esperanza, the forest is a bit taller. You have 25-meter trees, and you really have this sense of topography. You can see where the trees are positioned. You can see how the crowns are positioned relative to each other. This is data that's been difficult to measure in the past and very laborious. Now we're moving down into the lowlands. And this is a plot in Tambopata. We're going to fly in along the river here. And we're going to take a look at the forest from a side view. And again, you can get a sense of, this is a much taller forest, about 35 meters. You can get a sense of the density of information here and how much we can do with it. But also it might be difficult to parse apart all these point clouds and figure out what is actually happening in kind of this mess of points. So here's another plot right down the road from the one we just saw, and I'm going to highlight some work that our colleague Alvaro Sarmiento has been doing at Wageningen, which is you go in and you can isolate a particular tree, and you cut that out from the point cloud, and it actually is just this really rich source of information. And you can really see individual branches, the lengths of these branches, the width of these branches. You can imagine what kind of carbon measurements you could do on this when you really have a fuller sense of the volume of this, of all the woody parts of the tree. You can see where the leaves are for the most part. And you can see just very detailed information that you would have to climb a tree to really get in the past. And now you can do it from the comfort of your desktop. It's not, of course, a replacement for being in the forest. You lose, it's important to be there to gain ecological insight, to understand what's happening in these forests. But this is really just a rich source of information that we can use to make conclusions about branch architecture and lots of these questions that have been kind of intransigent in the past. We can also get these digital elevation models. So this is just of the same plot, an image of the ground, and you can see there's a river that goes through the plot. So now we can have a sense of the context of these forests, where these species are placed within the plot, how these species sort out in the hydrological regime of these forests, of these topographies. For the individual trees, going back to that, again, this is Alvaro's work. You can look at a topology of the tree, how all these branches are connected. You can start asking physiological questions like Nico Rab here is asking. If you connect all these nodes and you look at where the sources of photosynthate are and where they might go, you can start doing some functional analyses of these trees in very detailed ways that were difficult in the past. Other things that we can do is use light measurements and other measurements of the environment to produce much better constrained models of light throughout these forest plots. So as we measure vertical light profiles, we can couple that with these LiDAR point clouds and understand how light and structure are interacting in these forests, and have a better idea how these things might interact in a changing world. Finally, this is data not from our plots, but this is from Greg Asner's Carnegie missions. You can marry not just structure, but you can marry it with function. So these different colors indicate different chemical compositions of these canopies. And you can look at how these trees are sorting themselves and how not just these forests are structured, but how they're functioning, and these trees, how they can coexist together. So that's it. Acknowledgments to lots of the folks from Wageningen, Greg Asner, the field team, and various folks from Oxford. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the two ecosystems team people for getting us off to such a flying start. I'm already overexcited now with the possibilities of what our research can achieve. We're now going to move to a very different part of the School of Geography and the Environment and look at what the Transport Studies unit are achieving in their research. And transport studies, again, are a very long-standing part of the university and have been with School of Geography and the Environment now for several years. And Jenny Middleton is going to start off and tell us a little about them.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jenny Middleton, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow here in Mobilities and Human Geography, based in the Transport Studies unit. Now, what I'm going to do is spend a couple of minutes outlining who and what the TSU are and what we actually do, before handing over to one of our new research fellows, Dr. James Palmer, James is going to outline some of the research that he's currently involved with as a means of showcasing just one example of the range of research activities taking place within the unit. Okay, so the TSU, as you know, is a research centre based here in the School of Geography and the Environment. Now, TSU aims to be very much at the leading edge in national and international transport developments, with a particular emphasis on understanding the social, economic and environmental implications of transport over both time and space. Through its various incarnations over the last 40 years, it was established in 1973, the unit has established an international research reputation in the field of transport policy analysis, the development of new methodologies and behavioural studies. Now, the research within and across TSU takes a very much an interdisciplinary approach to the study of transport and mobility, drawing on relevant key developments in geography, environmental and transport studies, economics, sociology, psychology and the engineering sciences. Now, as you can see from the slide, the research activities within TSU tend to fall within 4 broad themes. First is governance and public policy, whereby the focus is very much on transport policy and governance, but at multiple geographical scales. Core strands of work include transport policy in a resource-efficient economy, the analysis of transport policy and planning, and governing low-carbon mobilities. The second theme relates to culture and society and very much concentrates on people's mobility against a backdrop of societal transformations such as population ageing, the growth of new information technologies and increasing income inequalities within and between nations. Third is work concerned with reduced energy consumption, behavioural change and socio-technical transitions towards low-carbon, energy-efficient transport systems. And the fourth and final research theme relates to health and well-being through consideration of the complex relationships between transport, health, well-being and sustainable development. Now, alongside this wide range of research activities and our significant contributions to undergraduate and postgraduate teaching here in the school, we also run a successful Global Challenges in Transport Leadership programme. Now, this programme is very much aimed at early to mid-career transport professionals from both the public and private sector. So that includes policymakers, practitioners, NGOs, academics and consultants. And the programme is run as 4 distinct courses that are 4 days long, and they're taught by leading academic, policy, business and industry experts who offer a range of disciplinary perspectives and sort of international experiences. Now, through lectures, seminars, workshops and field visits, the aim is very much on creating a stimulating dialogue from participants from a very diverse range of backgrounds around key transport questions, debates and challenges. So you can see that on the slide there's a flavour of the courses that run throughout the year, and we've just had a very successful one in December on health, wellbeing and urban mobility. Now, what I hope to have done is a very short space of time is give you a brief flavour of some of the things that TSU do before I hand over to James Palmer, who's going to say a bit about his research on transport and biofuels. Thank you.
And James now is going to move on the discussion a little bit and focus on one aspect of the rather wide group of work that they do in transport studies. And he's going to be talking to us about transport biofuels.
Well, thank you, Heather, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for coming to listen to me talk about one strand of research going on in the Transport Studies unit at the moment. What I'm going to talk about is a strand of research that focuses essentially on the politics of debates about the sustainability of biofuels, and particularly at European level, whether or not biofuels are something that we should be ploughing ahead with. So I'm sure you're all aware they've caused a lot of controversy over the past 10 years or so. And this research draws on a lot of qualitative data, so data derived essentially from interviews with lots of different participants in debates about biofuels at EU level, so policymakers in the European Commission, representatives of the renewable energy industry, of the agricultural sector, of environmental campaigning groups, wider scientific experts and so on. So one of the key sets of questions this research has tried to address fits within the Transport Studies Unit's governance and public policy research agenda. And really it's to do with how the European policy process works in issues relating to sustainable transport. And the key question really is, well, why is it that biofuels came onto the political agenda in Europe in the early part of the last decade, given particularly that we've known how to do biofuels, we've known technologically how to make them, how to run cars on them since the early 20th century, not the early 21st. So what was it that caused biofuels to shoot to the top of Europe's political agenda about 10 years ago? And the findings of the research are quite interesting, because the story that's routinely told by people I've interviewed is that actually about 10 years or so ago, biofuels weren't just seen as a way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector. They were also seen as a way of increasing income and the sort of financial security of the agricultural sector in Europe, because they provide a new market for farmers, and as a way of increasing Europe's energy security by reducing our dependence on petrol and diesel, basically. So what's interesting about biofuels in that respect is not so much that they were the best available solution to these problems at that particular time, roughly 10 years ago, but that they were the only solution which could be coupled onto all of these three problems at the same time. So they're a silver bullet in a sense. They're a solution to multiple problems simultaneously, and that's what gave them that added sort of appeal in the political sphere about 10 years or so ago. The next set of questions that the research tries to address fit more neatly within TSU's energy and environment research agenda. This is where biofuels are seen less as a sort of silver bullet and more as a kind of Pandora's box that we shouldn't have opened. You know, over the past 10 years or so, they've been associated with deforestation, with rising food prices, with land grabbing, with impacts on biodiversity, a whole host of things. And so the key question that the research tried to address here was, well, how have policymakers at European level responded to all this controversy? How have they continued to defend the idea of having targets for biofuels in the face of all of these issues? And again, the research came up with some fairly interesting findings in the sense that whilst all these things are discussed and have been discussed for a number of years in the wider public sphere, and you know, there's a lot of discourse out there which says that biofuels do lead in certain cases to these negative impacts. Within the political sphere in Europe, actually the exclusive focus of debates about whether or not biofuels are sustainable has been on greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's been an awful lot of work, scientific work at the kind of European level, undertaken, paid for by the European Commission to try and calculate the carbon footprint of different biofuels as accurately as you possibly can using modelling. And you might say, well, that's perfectly reasonable, because first and foremost, biofuels are a climate change mitigation policy. So if they're not doing that, first and foremost, then they're not fulfilling their objectives. So we should focus on greenhouse gas emissions. But the argument I would make is that we ought to be cautious, at least, of allowing ourselves to think that greenhouse gas emissions are the be-all and end-all of what it means to have a sustainable transport system. And this applies not just to the debate about biofuels, but I think to the debate about sustainable road transport more broadly. There's a lot of initiatives at EU level that try to deal with greenhouse gas emissions from road vehicles, incentives for the electric vehicle industry, regulations that seek to reduce emissions from the current vehicle fleet amongst them. Biofuels obviously are just one of those initiatives. The argument I would make is, yes, of course it's important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the road transport sector, and we should be doing that, but should it be the sole objective of what we want to achieve with a sustainable transport system? And so this is where the work that I'm doing is heading in the next sort of year, 18 months or so. We want to really engage with actual policymakers, actual transport practitioners at a range of levels, national level, EU level, and try and get them, or try and help them to reframe these debates about what we actually want from a sustainable transport system over the next 10, 20, 30 years, beyond just mitigating climate change. Should we be developing a transport system, for instance, that actually helps us to provide more equal access to facilities, services and jobs, that generates synergistic benefits for public health, that reduces social exclusion, reduces noise and air pollution? Why can't we have a transport system that reduces greenhouse gas emissions compared to today and does some other things as well? So this is really about trying to change the terms of the debate so that we're not just focusing on carbon accounting and actually focusing on, well, what benefits do we want our transport system to provide, not just to the environment, but to society and economies as well. And that's the end of my talk. Thanks for listening.
We're now going to go on and hear a little bit about the research done in the other unit that occupies one of those rather nice bits of accommodation. That's the Smith School for Enterprise and the Environment. That's the newest addition to what we might think of as the School of Geography and Environment family of academic researchers. They joined us about a year ago, and I think lots of us are really keen to know what they actually do behind those nice glass doors with their nice logo. So again, we're going to have two presentations from the Smith School. We're going to start off with Alex Money, who, as you can see, has dressed in very appropriate style for this high-energy running series of talks. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Heather. Apologies for the wardrobe malfunction. Yes, my name is Alex Money. It's my great pleasure to give a presentation on behalf of Gordon Clark, the director of the Smith School. The director of the Smith School. I don't have lots of slides about who we are and all of that stuff, partly because we built a brand new website and we're really trying to get the search rankings up a bit higher. So www.smithschool.ox.ac.uk talk a little bit about the people and our research strands. What I wanted to use these 3 minutes to do was to just talk about one project in particular, and Michael will talk about sustainable finance in a second. The Smith School, if you like, is a microcosm, I think, of what the work we try to do in this department is in terms of physical geography, human geography, and environmental geography. And a very good example of that is our water program, which is run by Rob Hope, who used to direct run or administer or manage the water MSc here. And one of the bits of work that several of you in this room are involved in is in the smart hand pump program. And you might know that in Africa, 40% of the hand pumps just don't work. So they're in place and all the money's been spent to put them in, but some small thing has gone wrong. And the difficulty has been to try to work out where things have gone wrong and why. And a team of people from here and working with engineering and other parts of this university developed an accelerometer, which you might find on a mobile phone or in a Wii game, and combined that with a SIM card, and retrofitted this device into handles of Mark II hand pumps, or AfriDev hand pumps, the sort that you use to raise water. By putting these things in, they're able to see whether the pumps are functioning, but actually even more than that, based on the accelerometer, they can tell the age or the gender of who might be using the pump, based on the motion and the angle, and even the depth at which the water is getting. And so you're using these hand pumps in diffuse areas to get maps of what water abstraction looks like. And this has interesting things from a science background, from a policy, from the economics. And as an example of the sort of work the Smith School tries to do, which I think crosses across some of these different disciplines. You've probably seen graphs or diagrams like this of the 5 capitals, manufactured capital being plants and machinery and buildings, financial capital, equity and debt, social capital, families, businesses, communities, human capital, health, education, and then natural capital, which is the resource around us. And I think to summarize what we're trying to do here is we're looking at the relationship between the responsibilities and the contribution that enterprise can make in that relationship with developing growth and everything else in a resource-constrained world. Right, that's enough from me. I hand over to a much better dressed Michael Vies, who will take you through another strand of our work, which is sustainable finance. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex, and I'm apologising for taking the mickey out of your excellent clothing. At least it's branded with the best college in Oxford, is all I can say. And I think his slide here of the 5 capitals really does illustrate, again, the breadth of work, even coming from the more economic perspective. This constant relationship between all the different aspects of our environment and our relationship with the environment are things that geography really focuses on. So now we're going to hand over to Michael Vies, who's going to tell us a bit more about it.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Alex. So in the next 7 minutes, I will briefly talk about one of the research strands that we have at the Smith School, which is sustainable finance. I will briefly introduce you to two main research projects that we did in the past and that we are doing currently. And it's very much related actually to also what TSU is doing, greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions. Before I start digging deeper into the research findings and the research we do, it's important to first say, okay, what do we actually understand when we are talking about sustainable finance? What does sustainability in finance actually mean? Because that's not so clear-cut. Sustainable finance is generally perceived as being a really ambiguous term, actually, because sustainable can, or the literature actually says that there's a two-way interpretation of sustainability in finance. The first one generally says, okay, firms can generate long-term profits and sustain them, so they can generate sustainable profits over the longer term period. But a second interpretation actually talks more about sustainability from the viewpoint that corporations should also respect the environment, the social issues of the workers, while actually maximizing shareholder value, maximizing firm value. And this is basically a not so clear-cut definition, and therefore we believe in the Smith School actually, and this is also what I will be talking about now, that sustainable finance actually combines both of these definitions. Yeah? On the one hand, firms and corporations should ensure that profits are maximized on a longer-term basis, but they should do it in a sustainable way, basically. So it's about generating sustainable returns sustainably. In order to check whether firms that are sustainable with respect to environmental practices or environmental management systems actually also show an outperformance or a kind of financial outperformance over the longer term, we conducted last year one meta-study on sustainability and corporate social responsibility, in which we reviewed more than 200 academic papers on the topics of sustainability, basically. The goal was basically to deliver a research piece to the financial industry which shows that yes, it makes a difference whether your firm is sustainable or not. And we reviewed more than 200 academic and industry reports. And what we basically find is that the overwhelming evidence or the overwhelming majority of the research studies actually show that yes, firms outperform on a longer term basis if they have sustainable business practices in place. So this is reflected in the financial performance. Share prices, stock prices are outperforming less sustainable firms. The operational performance of more sustainable firms are also better. And that's most interesting, firms actually have access to lower costs of capital. Yeah? So if a corporation, for example, wants to take on a new loan from a bank, these banks actually provide lower interest rates for more sustainable firms. And this is basically also the topic of the second research I would like to share with you actually, which is a current project that we are doing, because we have this evidence from this meta-study now, okay, but we were interested in more, okay, does this also really matter in practice, in reality? Do these effects really exist? And therefore we're conducting a new research piece on the carbon emissions of corporations and relate this to the cost of financing directly of corporations. The main research question being whether carbon emissions affect the level of the interest rates that corporations have to pay on their bank loans is basically the main research question of this paper. We got some interesting data from the Carbon Disclosure Project, which some of you might know actually, which is a non-profit organization based in London. And they collect all kinds of carbon emission data from major and big companies from all around the world. So we basically know how much Apple, for example, is emitting, how much is Microsoft emitting, all these kinds of information we have. And we wanted to check in how far banks pick up this extra financial information when they start pricing and assessing the creditworthiness of certain firms. Our hypothesis is basically, given the research findings from the meta-study, was that more sustainable firms pay lower cost of bank debt, and that's actually also what we find. So if we just compare these two graphs here, basically, as soon as firms start voluntarily disclosing CO2 emissions, they just pay roughly 150 basis points interest rates on their bank loans. But firms that do not want to voluntarily disclose CO2 emissions actually pay almost 200 basis points. This significance is actually also not only economically quite big when you consider that banks take on loans of multi-millions of dollars. This is also statistically significant. And this makes a huge difference when it comes to financing investment projects of big corporations. So overall, these two research pieces, more or less, or the whole finance, sustainable finance strand in the Smith School actually shows that firms have an incentive actually to improve their environmental standards, their environmental management systems, in order to become more responsible, more sustainable, which also translates into a financial outperformance compared to less sustainable counterparts, basically. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So we've heard now from two of the main research units, and we've also heard right at the start from one of the research clusters. And just to explain a little bit, the idea of having the 5 research clusters that we've got within the department was to try and really bring people together who had interests in common themes, but maybe were housed in different parts of the building, maybe were doing different types of individual research. So the next pair of presentations then is going to come from another of the research clusters. That's the Climate Systems and Policy Research Cluster. And that, like the ecosystems talk that we had from Yadvinder early on, shows the great diversity of different types of research. So Sebastian Engelstetter is going to introduce us to the cluster, and then Ian Ashpole is going to take us somewhere very murky.
Thank you very much. Okay, a very brief introduction to the Climate Systems and Policy Cluster, which broadly covers the physical, climate and biogeochemical processes, impacts and adaptation to climate change and mitigation policy. There's a variety of units or research groups the work of which falls into this cluster, including the Radcliffe Meteorological Station, the Climate Research Lab, the ECI, and the Water Research Group. There are strong links to other large interdisciplinary programs, such as the UK Climate Impact Programme or the Macronutrients Cycles Programme, as well as the Oxford Climate, Energy and Water Network. If you want to know more about the Climate Network, then Pete Walton, who is somewhere here, is your point of contact. Now, Miles Allen and Simon Detson are going to talk a bit later on. So in the next 2 slides, I'm just showing or going to talk about what's going on in the Climate Research Lab, which is jointly run by Miles Allen and Richard Washington. So Miles Allen's group tries to tackle the question whether or to which extent anthropogenic climate change alters the probability of extreme weather events, known as attribution studies. And they do this by analyzing large climate model ensembles, which are run on thousands of computers at people's homes, through the climateprediction.net Weather at Home program. So there's a long list of projects related to this. What we see here is just an example of for instance, the anomalously high surface temperatures in summer 2013, which is the focus of one of these studies. Now, the group of Richard Washington has a strong focus on African climate processes, in particular the study of mineral aerosols, including dust and rainfall. The dust projects have a strong observational component, which is combined with remote sensing and the analysis of climate models. Ian Ashpole is going to talk a bit more about one of these dust work. The rainfall work is primarily based on the analysis of climate and numerical weather prediction models. And for instance, Impala is a project which closely works with the UK Met Office in order to improve their model for Africa. And this is just an example of the representation of rainfall over the Congo Basin in the CMIP5 models, which is global models from different groups around the world, and we see large differences between them, but we don't really know what which one is right or wrong, or what causes these large discrepancies here. And last but not least, I would like to point out that the server in the department hosts the CLIVAX African Climate Atlas, which is a web page which allows you to interactively plot and partly analyze select fields from the CMIP5 dataset as well as reanalysis datasets. And with that, I'd like to pass on to Ian.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for covering a very large array of things. You might have noticed on one of Sebastian's early slides, hidden away, a mention of the Oxford Radcliffe Met Station. And of course, our next speaker is currently the Oxford Radcliffe Met Observer. Oh, not anymore. Oh, dear. But you were in the local paper recently, weren't you? Very proudly hiding behind his Stevenson screen. But actually, joking apart, showing the importance of some of these really long-term data collection exercises. They may not be very sexy, but they're very important in terms of, that's not a comment on Ian, by the way. They're very important in terms of generating data. Ian, take us to a bit of dusty place now.
I will do. Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you, Sebastian, for the introduction. Let me just work this. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little lesson, and it is a lesson, about dust emissions in the dust emission mechanisms in the Sahara. I'm giving the talk, but the work represents the efforts of many more people than I, and some of those contributors are listed there. Okay, so there's an animation going on there on the screen, and the point of this is to really illustrate that there is a lot of stuff up there in the atmosphere that we can't see. Aerosols are tiny microscopic particles that play a big role in the climate system. So there are a couple of points here listed about the various feedbacks and impacts that they have. And this is kind of the key motivator to some of the work that we're doing in this department. It's essential that we represent aerosol processes in climate models for the predictions to be as accurate as possible. And we focus on mineral dust here because it's the most abundant of all of the aerosol species. So yeah, the key justification is that we need to represent the feedbacks in climate models and Earth system models. And the first step here is accurately simulating the emission of dust from desert environments, dry land environments. When it comes to the emission of dust, there's really one key global player, and that's the Sahara Desert. There are two stories to tell about Saharan dust. One of them is in the Bedeli Depression in Chad, and that's a story that's been told very well in the past few years by Richard Washington and Sebastian, who just spoke to you. Unfortunately, I can't tell you that story because I don't have time, but I'm going to take you to an area to the west of that called the Central and Western Sahara. This is an area that we don't really know very much about at all. Each of these green blobs is a weather station that takes routine meteorological measurements and dust measurements. And you can see that there's a pretty big area there that has no weather stations whatsoever. It's a big meteorological hole, effectively. To give you some context, the map here shows you that the landmass that's covered, it is a vast area. And if you look at the density of weather monitoring stations in the UK, you can see that there's a big hole in our knowledge there. And you know, we sometimes like to complain about the weather forecast in the UK. Imagine what it's like for the Sahara. There's a plot here which is highlighting a dust hotspot. So this is a dust detection scheme that we've developed here in Oxford. And the red shading corresponds to a frequency of about 25% of the time. So if you were to look at that spot in the Sahara, 25% of the time there would be dust there. And this is a conservative estimate of dust coverage. The question that we've been tackling is, what is with that dust? Why is it there? Where does it come from? What meteorological mechanisms drive the emission of that dust? And that's what I'm going to talk about. There are two key mechanisms that act in this part of the Sahara. One of them is the low-level jet. So this is effectively a low-level wind speed maxima that picks up in the early morning. What you're looking at here is a satellite image. It's obviously false color. And the pink plumes you see there are dust. And this is an incredibly regular, well-understood process. It occurs on about 30% of the nights over deserts. And if those wind speeds peak over areas that are characterized by very fine sediment, the sediment gets picked up and blown away. The second key mechanism that operates is outflow from convective storms. So if you look at the southern edge of this image, wait for it to loop around again, you see a big front of dust being thrown up into Algeria. The convective outflow, effectively, it's related to thunderstorms or thunderstorm-like systems that develop in the southern Sahara, these red blobs here. And you get really strong, gusty winds that rush out from the storms, can propagate for hundreds of kilometers, and they pick up dust if they're very small sand particles, which is dust if there is any in the way. The question, these do look incredibly spectacular on the surface. So this is a convective outflow event. It's otherwise known as a haboob, and these are really dramatic walls of dust that rage across the desert. This here is the result of one particularly large convective outflow event, and that's a huge area covered by dust, and you can imagine that that's playing all sorts of games with the energy budget in the atmosphere. The question that we've been trying to answer is, how much dust do these different mechanisms exist? How important are these different mechanisms? There are two ways to answer that question. The first way is to go to the Sahara and try to study the dust in situ and attribute a mechanism to the dust that you're seeing. I've circled this green dot here. This is Borj Mukhtar, and this is a site that in the recent Fennec campaign was instrumented very heavily. Lots of meteorological and dust data were collected here, creating a treasure trove of information. And Christopher Allen, who sits among you, he did some really detailed detective work to try to ascribe a proportion of that dust to the different mechanisms. What we're interested in particular are the convective outflows. And you can see that around about 70% of the dust observed in Borj Mukhtar is attributed to these convective outflow events. That's all well and good, but that's one point in the Sahara. So some work that I've been involved in is trying to say how much dust comes from different sources and is associated with those events. So you can see that this is a source map of this area, and there are particular hotspots that emit dust preferentially over others. We're going to focus on this area here. This is a very busy plot, so to highlight what you want to look at, the color is all important. So the yellows, the oranges, and the reds highlight a very big contribution from convective outflow events, whereas the blues are very strong link to low-level jets. And you can see that in the southern Sahara, convective outflows are incredibly important in leading to the emission of dust. So on average, about 60% of the observed events here are linked to convective outflows. Okay, great. What does that mean for our efforts to model the emission of dust in climate models? What modelers are trying to represent is this pattern here. You want to see clear hotspots of emission. What models actually show is very different. Obviously, the scale of these two images is very different. This is a much more detailed image than that. But they're missing a key area of emission in the southern Sahara. And the reason that happens is actually very simple. It's almost an impossible task for the models because they're operating in a scale that simply cannot capture the convective outflow events. The events are literally missing from the models, so the mechanism that's driving the high wind speeds isn't there. Therefore, the dust just cannot be picked up. And that's the take-home message, really, that I want to leave you with. Not a very happy one, but there is a lot of dust missing from the models in the Sahara, and the reason for this is that climate models do not operate at a high enough spatial resolution to simulate the processes that are important. I should point out, I'm talking about climate models here. Regional weather prediction models can simulate these processes, but they do not run at the timescales necessary for climate prediction. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian, for an excellent lecture on Saharan climatology. There will be an exam at the end of the afternoon. We now move to one of our other research clusters. Now, some of the research clusters, as you've already seen, are mainly science-focused, natural science-focused. Some of our research clusters involve a broader suite of research traditions. And the one we're going to hear from next, Technological Natures, is largely a social science research cluster. And like all of the clusters, it involves people from very different parts of the department. And Tim Schwannen's going to introduce the research cluster and its activities and research profile, and he comes from the TSU, but he's also now jointly a core member of staff in geography. And then the second talk will be by Katarina Landstrom, who will give us a specific example of research in this area. So, Tim.
Thank you, Heather. I'll be talking more about the focus of what the cluster does rather than the people, which is slightly different maybe from what other clusters have been doing. But let me begin by talking about the name of the cluster, because in some ways this is an enigmatic name, but in others it describes quite well what the cluster is all about, because one of the key ideas behind the cluster is to disrupt any neat distinctions between nature and society, nature and human technology. Nature for us is not something that is out there, separate from human society. Rather, it's entangled with and co-constituted with all sorts of human practices and technologies in all kinds of complex and continuously changing ways. And it's that co-constitution, those entanglements, that are really at the heart of much of the research within the cluster. So some of the questions that are being addressed include: how does the materiality of such processes as drought, resource extraction, and global warming affect and mediate human experience and knowledge, as well as public debate and politics? What is the role of non-human things, from lab animals to bikes in a bike-sharing program, as you can see, for instance, in London, in how economies and environmental change are governed? And how do experimental practices in, for instance, bioconservation, the arts, and also academic research open up new ways of living with, experiencing, and understanding the Anthropocene? Now, these and other questions, for many of us, can only be addressed through new logics, methods, and concepts. So there's a strong commitment to theoretical and methodological innovation that pushes the boundaries of both common sense and scientific convention. And there's also a strong commitment to transcending the boundaries between disciplines: geography, science and technology studies, the humanities, information science, engineering, the life sciences, and so on and so forth, as well as a strong commitment to transcending the boundaries between academic research, design, and the performing arts. At a more concrete level, I would say that there are three key research foci around which the work in the cluster is organized. The first of these is materialities and their role in society, the economy, and culture. And research here really focuses on a wide range of forms. Water, tigers, oil, smartphones are just some of the examples of the things that we're interested in. And in all cases, the emphasis is on their behavior and the effects that are being generated, and on how these materialities are imagined and governed. Mobilities is the second focal theme. The transport of people and goods features prominently here, not least because of the strong linkages between the cluster and the TSU. But there are other mobilities that are being considered as well. There's substantial interest, for instance, in the digital mobilities and big data that are now being enabled by modern communication infrastructures. And there's also a lot of work on the movements of human bodies in, for instance, artistic practices. And key interests here relate to the lived experience and governance of mobilities, as well as the social, economic, and political effects that they generate. And the final theme is politics in its various guises. So some of the research considers the geopolitics of resource extraction and bioconservation. But other key concerns revolve around knowledge controversies and who or what participates in processes of governance, decision-making, and policy. And as part of work in this area, Sarah Watmore and Katharina Landström have developed innovative methods to what they call redistribute expertise and to reconfigure computer modeling. And they've originally developed these kinds of methods in research on flooding, and they're now working on drought. And it's on that work that Katharina will now continue the presentation of the cluster. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. That was a really good introduction to the more complex, that's from my perspective as a natural scientist, world of the social sciences. And Katharina, who's going to be giving the next talk, as Tim said, has worked previously with Sarah Watmore on flooding and trying to bring together local people with so-called experts to generate new ways of looking at flooding. And the work that they did was a very important part of our recent REF submission. It was one of the very successful impact case studies, and shows again another important dimension of the research, all of the research that we're looking at today, that it has impact on people's lives, policies and activities. And so now Katerina's going to tell us a bit more about how this work has developed in terms of mapping drought knowledges across the UK. So over to Katerina.
I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you about what I'm working on right now. Not what I've done before. I'll move on. So what I'm doing now is that I'm mapping drought knowledges. And I'm doing that from within the Marius project that was mentioned before. So my research context is coming from within this project, which is a large interdisciplinary project. Lots of people here in SOGI are working in this project. There's also people in other sites like Bristol and Cranfield and the CAH and so on. Marius is one of 4 NERC projects financed through a drought and water scarcity in the UK programme. So it's interdisciplinary, and for once there are actually more than one social science teams. So there's lots and lots of physical modelers, as always, everywhere. But there's also one team on law and economics, and they're also here in Oxford, and then there's us in human geography / STS. And the combination of human geography and STS is quite important for what I'm doing, because it gives me my theoretical perspective. So this is where the idea of working with entanglements come from. So I'm coming from science and technology studies. I'm really interested in how human and non-human entangles, how nature and society is co-produced, how things are always also political. And we use, when I talk to people in the same field, we use a lot of the concepts like hybrid, more than human, co-production, things like that that nobody understands outside of our field. And in that context, my work often seems rather banal, rather trivial, like mapping, what's that? Description? Hey, can't you move on from description? Come to the good analytical stuff when you can use high-level concepts. Yeah, however, I insist, following Bruno Latour, who is one of our gurus, I insist that description is important. Now, he says that to describe, to be attentive to the concrete states of affairs, to find the uniquely adequate account of a given situation is incredibly demanding. He also says that inquiries, polls, whatever, we go, we listen, we learn, we practice, we become competent. We change our views. Good fieldwork always produces a lot of descriptions. So I think of my mapping as a way of describing the world that can teach us new things. So I'm trying to do good fieldwork here by working from within the Marius Consortium, which will be working until 2017. And in that project, I work with participant observation, looking at the knowledge practices, using the documentation I can get hold of, following all the meetings, of course. I also do in-depth interviews with our project team researchers and with stakeholder representatives, because of course we got stakeholders. Everybody got stakeholders nowadays. And we do a lot of things with them. So, and they sort of actually interviewing stakeholders, it goes down very well because nobody really knows what to do with them. So they get very happy when I ring them up and say, hey, would you tell me what you think for an hour and a half? Oh, yeah. So I get a lot of information from that. I also sort of work out from Marius outside with the snowballing technologies. So like, asking everybody who I interview to point me to more people to interview that I don't know, that are not associated with Marius. So where I'm hoping to get from this, because we got stakeholders, and I've been doing this before, and I don't want to write just another article about this, I want to do something else. I actually want to take this mapping thing quite literally. So what I want to do when I think about this, my first step is looking something like this. I want to create a map. So this would be what it looks like, the relationship between the knowledge production in areas, the stakeholders, and the wider network. So the dense bit here would be like areas and stakeholders, and then they would have connection. Like, for example, a water company might link to a lot of other water companies, creating a little lump that might link to a PhD program, that might link us to, let's say, Liverpool University or Newcastle University. So I get that kind of shape of map of drought knowledges starting with the Marius project. Of course, I want to move on to the next bit. I also want to look what are the practices. So I want sort of filters or layers to sort of tip that one over to the side. Everybody's doing drought knowledges, but what kind of practices, what kind of knowledge practices are they involved with? Some might use, if I use water resource modeling as one filter, some of the actors mapped in there will also be connected by using that kind of modeling. I might want to use monitoring, rainfall monitoring, for example. Some of the actors might be connected by that and some will not. So I will actually, by looking at this, by doing this, I will get a very much deeper understanding of the relationships creating knowledge about drought in the UK. Because these maps, sort of, if you look at the legend of this map, there will be in these visualizations, I will have actors, I will have research practices, I will have monitoring technologies, I will have techno-scientific devices, I will have natural things. So I will actually be able to visualize relationships between a lot of different kinds of things. Not just sort of relationship between humans, but between humans and things, humans and practices, and so on. So this visualization of entanglements of drought knowledge mapping will be a way to include humans and things, norms and techniques, facts and institutions, tools and beliefs in the same picture. And this is something that's very different from the way in which we social scientists usually present our work, because I usually, or normally, well, I have to do that as well, but write a narrative about who knows who and who does what. That would be the normal thing. I'm happy to do that, but it would be nice to talk to somebody else in a new way. And I know for sure that our stakeholders will never read that article. So, what I don't know yet. That's so much fun with this. I don't know what the UK drought knowledge maps are going to look like. I might probably come up with a lot of different visualizations, a lot of different maps. It's quite possible that some things will look like irradiating from a center and come out like that, for example, if we look at modeling approaches. Other things might look like some actors with very, very strong ties. For example, people were looking at drought in chalk streams. Other things might be looking like very few actors with influence, like on regulatory decisions and so on. And I might come up with some of those very dense practices where one practice is adopted by all, like rainfall, using rainfall data or whatever. So that's why it's so exciting. I don't know where I'm going to go with this yet. And thank you for paying attention to that.
Thank you very much. Really good to see all these different types of visualization, and you can start, if you've got a strange mind like me, to see lots of similarities and things running through these presentations. So having had a research cluster, we're now going to go and have a couple of presentations from the third of our big research units in the department. That's the Environmental Change Institute. And that, again, is situated upstairs in a very smart, swanky part of the building, known bizarrely as Pleasure Island, Paradise Island, sorry. You're getting a very interesting insight into my brain processes today. So, talking of pleasure, let me introduce Miles Allen.
I don't know how to follow that at all. Heather Heather confided to me earlier that she saw her role here as kind of a Michael McIntyre role. So I think we're really seeing this coming out now. So I'm Miles Allen, introducing the Environmental Change Institute, which is, as Heather said, is one of the big units within the school. That's the mission of the ECI. And it's very explicitly an interdisciplinary research center, and that's actually what drew me to the ECI and to the school a few years ago. I've been for an embarrassingly long time in the Department of Physics here in Oxford, but I was finding myself, although I was using the tools of physics in pretty much everything I was doing in terms of equations and modeling and so forth, I was having to apologize more and more for saying, well, you know, this is sort of physics, isn't it? And the other physicists were saying, well, not really. And so it was a great relief to move to a department where nobody's quite sure what they're doing. So it's sort of easy to say that what I'm doing fits in, because, you know, it's easy to fit. So that's the beauty of interdisciplinary work, is nobody's quite sure what it is. So this is the key part. One of the key elements of ECI is the interdisciplinary nature of our understanding of processes of change, but it's also the practical focus of ECI's work, which is another hallmark of what we do. We want to understand processes of change, but also explore sustainable solutions, and then influencing change through partnership and through our education program, which is the flagship of which is the Environmental Change and Management MSc program. There's 5 strands to the ECI's work. It's sort of loosely organized around climate, water, ecosystems, food, and energy. And I'll just take you through these briefly so that you know who's leading them and what they cover, before handing over to Simon, who's going to talk to us a bit more about some key highlights from the water security area of work. A lot of these topics within the ECI are sort of overlapping parts of a Venn diagram covering the work of the school. One of the attractive aspects of the school, actually, is, for me, is it is quite hard to draw lines through it. That's the whole point of an interdisciplinary school. We're not quite sure which group people are working in. That's the way it should be. And the Forests and Ecosystems group, you've already heard from Yavinda Mali. Yavinda is also within the ECI, and a lot of that work, a lot of the work within his group also links up with the broader interdisciplinary work of the ECI program. We have also the Lower Carbon Futures group within the ECI, led by Nick Eyre, and they are focusing primarily, what they're very well known for is the role of social and individual behavior in determining carbon consumption. So it's people tend to think of climate policy and energy policy in terms of very big things, power stations, grids, nuclear programs, and so forth. And in the end, it's individuals, it's you and me, that actually use energy and determine the total demand for this stuff. And what the Lower Carbon Futures program is world renowned for is understanding how individual behavior decisions all collectively build up into our carbon future. They also work a lot on technologies as well. They don't just work on behavior, and also, of course, on the macro stuff of policy formulation and understanding markets, in particular carbon markets, which, of course, is a key part of the overall policy framework for regulating, for doing something, if we do eventually manage to do anything about climate change. My own work is on climate impacts, and I'm within the climate group, but just to mention there's other parts of that's already been talked about a bit by Sebastian, but there's also the UK Climate Impacts Programme led by Roger, and then the climateprediction.net Weather at Home initiative, which is led by Freddie Otto, so I put those up there as well. Within ECI we have the Food Security Programme, led by John Ingram, and it's a new part of the ECI's work. It's a new program drawn in to the School of Geography. Food is a very hot topic at the moment, and this is something which is really developing within the school. There's a huge amount of interest in people trying to work out, how exactly are we going to feed ourselves when we all, want to eat meat in 30 years' time, and there's lots of us as well. And so trying to work out how that's going to work, and what the different stresses are that's going to well, not only eat meat but throw most of it away. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting questions that the food program looks at, and they work again like the other parts of the ECI very closely with stakeholders. Yeah, we all like stakeholders, don't we? There was a joke there, but it was so subtle nobody laughed. But I'll make my jokes more obvious now in the future. But they work with for example, the supermarket chains and working at analysing wastage and so forth in the food chain. The water security network is Simon's going to talk much more about, so I won't dwell on that. But that's just apart from to say that it's led by Jim Hall, who is also the ECI director. And I realised, of course, when I started off, I forgot to mention that I am standing in for Jim Hall, who is actually in charge of the ECI, just in case you get any ideas. Okay, finally, let me just wrap up by mentioning that we of course have a lot of cross-cutting initiatives which don't really fit neatly within these different themes within the ECI, and the most important of these, I feel at least, is the Masters in Environmental Change and Management, which is this very international, highly interdisciplinary program that the ECI has been running for over 25 years now, which is, draws people from all corners of the globe and has perhaps one of our most influential outputs in the long term. And that's led by Tom Thornton, who I've just spotted in the corner there. One of the, just before I forget, I do want to highlight, sort of talking of networking people, there are a number of research networks coordinated within ECI. One of those is the Oxford Climate Research Network. Pete Walton's at the back there. Give us a wave, Pete. Okay, so if you're interested in climate research in the university, then we do actually try and coordinate these things, and Pete is coordinating the climate. So if you want to make links with that, Pete's your man. But at that point, I'm going to hand over to Simon, because he's going to be telling us about water security risk and growth as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miles. That really captures the huge diversity of what's going on in the ECI, and specifically, just to follow on Miles's point, the difficulty of categorising people's research and putting us into little boxes. However we organise our research, of course, what really motivates us is our own individual drive, connections, the sorts of things that we hope you might find today. And if we work from a kind of a bottom-up approach, then it's really difficult to fit us into these groups or institutes or clusters or whatever. And a good example of that now, the difficulty of putting somebody into a box, is Simon Dadson, who wears many hats in the department, but he's going to talk to us about his work on water security.
Thank you, Heather. I'm afraid all I heard of that was bottoms up and being put in a box, but I'm sure what you said was lovely. I'm going to talk about water security risk and growth, and this is a piece of work which cuts across the ECI and the geography department, and it's a piece of work in which we're trying to unpick the links between the physical hydroclimatic aspects of water security and water resources and the more social, political management aspects of managing water, connected with governance, connected with economic growth. And so to motivate what we've been doing, let me show you a few examples. This is a set of slides which shows the effects of hydroclimatic risk on economies. You can see on the left-hand side picture there the exposed bottom of a reservoir in the Ebro Basin in Spain. What you can see is the water levels having reduced to such an extent, this is in 2008, to such an extent that you can see emerging at the bottom of the reservoir the village that was drowned to create that dam. This was because at that time the catchment was suffering one of its most severe droughts in recent years. It's an interesting location. It's the river that feeds Barcelona, from which Barcelona gets lots of its water supply from. And so Barcelona, being a relatively wealthy city, could afford to import water to make up for the lack of water that was there during this drought. It could afford to import water, and importantly, it couldn't afford not to import water, because the role of tourism in the economy of Barcelona meant that it was simply impossible for Barcelona to run out of water. What other sorts of responses do we get to different kinds of hydroclimatic risk? Well, this is moving similarly within a developed country to the UK, thinking about flooding and storm damage during floods which happened in 2007 on the right-hand side and more recently in 2014 on the left-hand side. You can see the links between the different sorts of hydroclimatic risks that we face in a country like the UK and the other infrastructure investments in the environment. On the right-hand side, flooding in the Thames Valley of an area which is an electricity substation gives this problem of correlated risk. You're producing damage as a result of flood risk, but you're also knocking out some of the infrastructure that you might like to use to respond to that sort of risk when those disasters happen. Similarly, the case of the seawall collapse in Dawlish in February 2014, where you have a hydroclimatic risk. It's a risk here which is coupled with risks from the sea as well, but it's a risk which endangers lots of other aspects of the economy. It hampers growth, and that's the important message from this piece of research, that we're seeing a very complicated connection between the ways in which hydrological infrastructure allows productive investment in the economy and also the ways in which it might protect the economy from losses. Trying to capture those links, those two-way links, is really part of the research here. The other important message here is that just as in Barcelona, it was possible in a wealthy economy to divert capital to recovering from the effects of those hydroclimatic events. David Cameron at the time said, and I'm sure he regrets saying it, but money is no object in this relief effort. Whatever money is needed for it will be spent. And that's a very serious sort of policy. I'm sure he didn't mean to make policy on the fly there, but it's an interesting position to find oneself in as a country, that whatever damage is done, it's regarded as so important to remedy that damage because it's affecting growth and likely to affect growth in other ways as well. What happens if you move to look at the effects of hydroclimatic risks and hydroclimatic extremes in different areas of the world? This is an image, an iconic image from the Thai floods in 2011, and you can see the Sony factory there, which has been left underwater by this series of floods in Thailand in 2011. That's one of the biggest factories in the world manufacturing hard disks, computer hard disks, and the price of computer components increased by about 50% when this production facility was knocked out during the Thai floods in 2011. So this is an impact which reverberates around world markets and it affects the economy in a way which is much more important than just the local economy in Thailand. It caused $43 billion worth of losses, only $16 billion of which were insured, and 2.2 billion of those were insured through Lloyd's of London. It was the biggest loss for a long time that Lloyd's of London had faced. And importantly, in the context of the Thai economy, it deterred a lot of other foreign direct investment. So people looking to build factories and increase their industrial presence in Thailand were deterred by this new realization that there was a level of flood risk that wasn't managed in that area. Moving to the other another part of the scale of economic development, this is a slide showing some effects from the East African drought in 2011-2012. Here, it's not economies that are suffering, it's people themselves. Up to 260,000 people dying, roughly 1 million refugees just in this one drought event between 2011 and 2012. And so the impacts here are more than economic, they're humanitarian, and they create health crises, they create security crises, and they reverberate not just around the East African region, but worldwide. And so how can we start to try to understand these various ways in which hydroclimatic risk plays out in the economy, in society, in different ways? Well, there have been a range of ways of trying to conceptualize that and trying to think about it. And one of those is through the concept of water security, that it's necessary to manage hydroclimatic risk in an economy to the point where you have a tolerable level of water-related risk to society. And that tolerable level of risk comes not just from the endowment, the physical climate, the hydroclimatic risk that you might face in a particular country. It also comes from the ability of the people in that country to invest in infrastructure, to invest in institutions, and to invest in information systems to try to manage those problems. So it's a multivariate problem, and one that plays out in different ways in different countries around the world. This is an example from a paper which David Gray and colleagues published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, trying to create a typology of different countries and different situations where those water-related risks played out in different ways. And so you can see that where you have a high capacity on the left-hand side at the top, a high capacity to invest in those mechanisms to mitigate hydroclimatic risk, and where you have a low hydroclimatic risk in the first place, places like the eastern part of North America, Northern Europe and so on, that's an area where water security is relatively high. By contrast, if you have a highly complex hydroclimatic regime, lots of interannual and intra-annual variability, lots of extremes causing damage to the economy, and a low capability to invest in the sorts of mechanisms that can be used to manage those problems, then you have a very fragile water security, and sometimes you could be water insecure in the sense that the level of residual hydroclimatic risk is not manageable. Building on this, Jim Hall and me and various other colleagues have tried to put some numbers to this concept, and we find a very interesting pattern that if you try to measure the variability on the horizontal axis in the climate, and try to measure the capability of a nation to manage that variability, then the river basins that are plotted on that diagram play out in exactly the way that would be expected from that typology that came from David Gray's paper. And so you see the countries that have a high ability to invest and a low interannual variability with high incomes, they're water secure. By contrast, countries that don't have that ability to invest and have high runoff variability find it less straightforward to invest in water-related technologies, and so are water insecure. The questions that remain then are what's the resilience of this distribution? This is what we see now. It's a snapshot of what's playing out in the world at the moment. How resilient are these situations to future change, and what controls the way in which a country might develop its development pathway to move around in that space? What controls the dynamics of the system? What are the effects of hydroclimatic shocks if climate change comes in, for example, and changes the rate of hydroclimatic variability? How does that feed through into the economy? The diagrams up here are a very interesting way which the IPCC in its latest report has of describing hydroclimatic risk. These are plots which show with the cross-hatching the areas where future projections are thought to be within the envelope of historical natural variability. And so you can see for relatively low concentration pathways on the left-hand side, most of Northwest Europe is within the range of the envelope of hydroclimatic variability from the present day. But as you move to higher concentration pathways, the RCP 8.5, particularly around the Mediterranean, this is an area which is crucially important for hydroclimatic risk, particularly around the Mediterranean, you see the regime moving out of that envelope of natural variability. So what we try to do is try to conceptualize in a very simplistic fashion how the hydroclimatic risk and the rate of economic growth play through together, how they interact. It's clearly an interacting system. There isn't one primary variable where you can establish cause and effect. If you have a wealthy country, it can manage its hydroclimatic risk more effectively than if the country isn't wealthy. And if the country has a low level of hydroclimatic risk, then it has less to manage in the first place. And so you can conceive of a very simple model of how hydroclimatic risk interacts with wealth in the economy. You have wealth as a reservoir of money in the economy. Economic growth acts to increase that reservoir, and at various points people can make a decision to invest in water-related assets which have a protective benefit in the economy. They reduce the rate of exogenous losses from the economy as a result of floods and droughts, for example. And they also have a productive benefit. If you have hydropower, for example, then you have returns to the economy as a result of making those investments. How can we try to see how this sort of approach tells us how countries move around in that development space? Well, there are lots of ways of analysing a system like that. This is the most simple. This is a way of producing what's called a direction field, and this is like a little road map where you can say, well, okay, if you start at one particular location, which direction will my economy head off in? So if you start at point A, for example, on these axes which represent on the horizontal the endowment or investment in water security that you've made to date, so water secure is over on the right and very fragile is over on the left, and country wealth on the vertical axis. If you start at A, relatively modest water security and about average wealth, then what's your trajectory? This is like somewhere like California or southeastern Australia. Well, your trajectory is first to draw wealth down. You have to draw wealth down to build hydrological infrastructure. But once you do that, you can start to feel the benefit through risk reduction, the benefit through productive returns to the economy, and the trajectory is one of growth upwards. What if you start from the same hydroclimatic position but with a lower level of initial wealth? Well, you're still subject to regular economic losses through flood and drought. This is point B on the diagram. Those losses are, however, in relation to the level of wealth that the country has, those losses are such that when they occur, there isn't enough time in between the pattern of those losses to replenish the economy, to grow in order to stave off those losses. And the trajectory is one of decay. Wealth is being destroyed in the economy as a result of this repeated pattern of hydroclimatic losses. What happens if you move to point D? Well, point D is an area where you have, a bit like the UK, I suppose, in the 18th century, you have a relatively high endowment of water security, relatively benign hydroclimatic environment, but not much wealth. You're not suffering losses very often, and so your economy can grow. If you stick with point D and think, well, what happens if we suffer an exogenous shift? If you imagine shifting your water security to the left as a result of climate change, what's the result? Well, you move to a part of the space where growth is slower. You're still able to grow, but you're suffering hydroclimatic losses at a rate which hampers your growth. What if you move a little bit further to the left? Well, if you cross that tipping point in the middle of the diagram here, you end up on the other side where those hydroclimatic losses are occurring at such a frequency that your rate of growth isn't enough to sustain during the intervening periods. And so you end up stuck in a poverty trap as a result of that. What can we do about it? And I'm wrapping up so that we can hand over to the next person. What can we do about it? Well, if you think of a country which is in the poverty trap, a point at C on the diagram there, the obvious choice is to invest in water security. If you invest in water security, you move out of harm's way, out of the poverty trap, and onto a growth trajectory. But you could also invest in the economy. You could also promote growth across the economy, and that would be another way to get out of the poverty trap. But as you've probably spotted, the more effective solution would be to do a combination, a judicious combination of the two, where you're investing in water-related assets, but you're also driving other sectors of the economy, and that line is a much shorter route out of the poverty trap. This is a piece of work which we're taking forward into policy through the World Bank and the OECD to try to inform how people might want to make investments in water security into the future. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Simon, for, again, not only introducing us to some really interesting research, but demonstrating very clearly the potential impact that is going to have in the future. And I would expect that the results of this kind of research will form the impact case studies or whatever we have to produce in 5 years' time for the next REF assessment. So our next set of presentations then takes us back to one of our research clusters, and this is the Transformations Research Cluster, another of the predominantly social science based clusters. And this also involves people from all parts of the School of Geography and the Environment interested in similar kinds of themes. If you think that I'm slightly flanneling here, that's absolutely true, because as a natural scientist, I have no idea what they do at all. So I am looking forward to this presentation even more than most of you. And we're going to start off with Fiona McConnell, who's going to introduce the cluster.
Many thanks, Heather. So I'm just here to say a very few words about the Transformations, Economy, Society and Place cluster. And we're really a very diverse and dynamic group of human geographers, both here in geography as well as connections with transport studies and the Smith School. And like human geography more generally, the range of our research interests, both empirically and theoretically, is really broad and quite eclectic, which meant that trying to provide an overview of the research cluster interests was a pretty daunting task. So unlike my physical geography colleagues who can do very sophisticated representations on screen, I'm afraid I got some text from the profiles of some of our cluster members and put it in one of those cloud generating websites and came out with this, but I think it gives quite a good flavour of some of the themes and also the diversity of our research interests. And there are a number of common themes across our work. These centre on both institutional and life cycle change, on intergenerational equity, on mobilities and transformations at different spatial scales in the geography of economic, social and cultural process, and also a focus on combining both in-depth and often ethnographic field work with a critical engagement with a range of different social theories. As such, this draws on strengths within the school on geographies of social justice and social change, on modes of political action and governance, on identity politics around gender, around ethnicity and class, and on finance, work and employment. And within those broad cross-cutting themes, our research interests span both the global north and the global south, with research areas focusing on areas as diverse as Russia and the UK, Germany to India, China to the Arctic. Indeed, the fact that a lot of us focus on, at least part of our research, on very particular areas and regions of the world was a theme which was explored in fascinating detail in a workshop co-organised by the cluster earlier this week in the department. And in response to the fact that many of us undertake research in a diverse range of fields for quite prolonged periods of time, a new Transformations blog was established earlier this year by students in the cluster. And it's proved to be a really productive forum for sharing ideas, challenges and points of contention. So far it's focused on issues from youth culture and politics to the spatialisation of the state, and segueing very nicely into Ian Clinker's talk on issues around NATO and the nuclear arms race. So I'll pass over to Ian. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and that really demonstrates that in order to learn about the research a bit more, I need to look at their blog, which looks very exciting. I was particularly interested to see in that word cloud that the word including appears in it. So I want to talk to people afterwards at the drinks and food to find out whose research covers including. No doubt that probably is somebody doing that. So we're now going to move on to Ian Clinker, who's going to be talking about his work on geopolitics and NATO, and he's currently being dressed by our microphone wardrobe master over there, who's doing a very good, quiet job for us. Thank you.
So I hope you're still alive. So I'll start by saying that I'm a political geographer, and what that means is that I get to explore all kinds of political spaces, starting from the maps that hang in the Pentagon all the way to the architectural spaces that can be found at interstate borders. But today I'd like to talk a little bit about two iconic spaces, political spaces of our time, the 20th century, the concentration camp and the nuclear bunker. And in doing so, I'd like to convince you of a very simple idea of mine, which is that a nuclear bunker is a reproduction but also an inversion of a concentration camp. In his book, Barbed Wire, A Political Ecology of Modernity, the Israeli scholar Revier Netz argues that barbed wire is the fundamental political technology of our time. And he traces the history of barbed wire from its emergence on the American West and the herding of cattle through the battlefields of World War I, and to the herding of what he refers to as human cattle in the Nazi death camp. And in the opening pages of the book, he suggests that barbed wire is responsible for organizing the three fundamental social institutions of our time: private property, the prison, and the border. But his history ends rather abruptly in 1945, and so what he misses is how barbed wire after 1945 was resurrected as razor wire. And razor wire was, of course, used during the Cold War to protect all kinds of bunkered military installations, those that were meant to protect life, like the nuclear bunker, or those that were built to take life, like the bunkered missile silo. And I think these Cold War structures exhibit traces of Netz's three institutions, but they also have to be understood as spaces in their own right. And in order to understand how they reproduce and invert the logic of the concentration camp, we have to go back to the Third Reich. Now, Lebensraum is a Lebensraum is a German term, translates as living space. Emerged in the 19th century as a simultaneously biological and geographical term. It had a rather infamous history in the 20th century for legitimating the Third Reich's conquest of an empire in Eastern Europe. Its purpose was to secure the survival of the Germanic race for the next millennium through a vast resettlement and repopulation program. But Nazi living space is more than just territorial conquest and the building of homes such as these. It was also about the expulsion and extermination of unwanted populations from that space. And this was very much, of course, done in the Third Reich's network of concentration and death camps. And so these confined spaces are a direct counter-dimension to the open fantasy of open space in Eastern Europe. And they have to be understood together. And so the question I'm really asking is, what happened to this particular configuration of survival, extermination, confined space, and vast and open spaces after 1945? In some of my recent work, I've argued that the Third Reich's obsession with survival and extermination didn't simply disappear, but it merely went underground. It was sort of poured into concrete. And I start from the observation that the German term Raum translates into English both as space but also as room, and it therefore captures both open and confined spaces. And this we can take further to understand the relationship between the survival machine of the nuclear bunker and the concentration camps. So both of these spaces were created and perfected in an environment of total war. They relied on and were enabled by highly sophisticated apparatuses of logistics. Both of those spaces revealed an obsession with hermetically sealed space with autarky. And both were spaces of exception. They were enabled by all kinds of emergency legislations. Like the Nazi living space, I would argue the Cold War version entailed a valorization of the family and the suburban or rural home. And this is a photo of a nuclear bunker under a villa in Las Vegas, which recently went up for sale. So both spaces are driven by the fantasy of survival of a species or of a race or even of a family. We know, of course, that emergency planners during the Cold War were thinking through the repopulation of the world after a nuclear attack. And so what I'd like to do in my final slide is to show you a few images from a site on which I've been working for the last 16 months. I'm doing a lot of archival research on this particular bunker. And it's the West German government's now abandoned nuclear bunker, which could host 2,000 inhabitants for 2 weeks into a nuclear war. And I picked the site because it was actually constructed into a World War II subterranean concentration camp, which was a sub-camp of the infamous Buchenwald. And the first sinister connections between the two spaces, the bunker and the camp, is that there were a whole range of former Wehrmacht generals and even members of the SS who were involved after the war in building the bunker. They're also pretty much the same company. So we've got the same company that built the Führer bunker in Berlin, but also somewhat sinister is that the same company that built the crematoria at Auschwitz was involved in building this bunker. But I think there's more to this. In this place, extermination was also rendered rational, possible and rational. So there was a string of NATO simulations in which the West German government accepted that nuclear weapons would be released and used on own West German territory. So there's a very suicidal dimension to this. And they also played a scenario of a resupply of forces after a nuclear war in Europe. And so crucial to my understanding of the space is the idea that it is indeed an inversion. And we're sort of faced with a concentration camp which has been turned inside out. And in the paper, this draws on, I give a few more examples, but I'll just limit myself to 3. So the first is that the watchtowers here are directed outwards. They are meant to stop the population from trying to get a place in the bunker, which was only meant for the political and military elite, of course. A second example would be the fact that the original bunker had slave laborers had produced the V2 rocket. Now the V2 rocket became the prototype both of the American and the Soviet missile programs. And so the very weapons that had once been produced in the underground concentration camp returned in the Cold War to haunt this site. And the third, the yellow image here, is of the decontamination shower. So this is for bodies that had been radioactively contaminated and wanted to gain access into the bunker again, and they had to be showered with citric acid. So this is a shower that potentially gives life rather than taking it. And I'm sure you can understand how this inverts the so-called showers in the Nazi concentration camps. But here too was a decision of life and death, because as I found out in one of the documents, a body that was too heavily contaminated would have not been let back into the bunker because it was deemed unsafe. It would have been left to die outside. So this leads me to the conclusion that the bunker protected its living space from the nuclear holocaust outside. Now, so how relevant is all of this for us today? Isn't this all a little bit Dr. Strangelove? Perhaps. I mean, nuclear bunkers are largely obsolete. By the 1960s and 70s, thermonuclear weapons had become so powerful that it was almost impossible to hide in the ground from them once a bunker had been located. But there are still American companies today that offer places in so-called doomsday bunkers, and are meant to protect you from a whole range of military but also ecological threats. And nuclear weapons are, of course, still around us. I mean, the M40 is one of the key routes for nuclear weapons from Aldermaston up to Scotland. But sometimes they also end up in RAF Prize Norton, which is just in Oxfordshire. And so if you know what to look for, you want to see these convoys, you can spot them from time to time. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ian. Very thought-provoking. So we're going to finish off now with 2 talks about the last in our research clusters, the landscape dynamics cluster. And I should say this is last but not least, and obviously I would say that because I'm a member of this cluster, but also because somebody has to be last in these linear system of programming events. But of course, as the whole point of the afternoon is to show how interlinked everything is, there is no beginning and there is no end at all in terms of our research. I'm getting deeply philosophical now, which is quite scary for me. So let's turn to Richard Bailey, who's going to introduce the landscape dynamics cluster for us.
So landscapes. Landscapes are really the physical interface between what's above the atmosphere and what's below the solid Earth. They're a zone of intense dynamism there where things move around, they grow, they die, they interact in lots of ways. And over, of course, lots and lots of different timescales. The landscapes are also hubs and intermediaries for connections between lots of other different kinds of things, including social interactions and people. And we're interested in our cluster in all of these things. We use modelling, we use a whole range of modelling techniques, we use equipment, and we also use lots of field-based equipment and field-based methods. In fact, you could probably describe what we do as leaving odd pieces of equipment in some of the most beautiful places in the world. I think that would be a reasonable description of it. Namibia is one of those beautiful places that we sometimes go to, luckily. We study the natural processes that begin this cycle, breaking down the basic geological material down into sedimentary particles. This is important because it begins the whole process of engineering soils that goes to plants, to ecosystems, etc. So it's very important we understand these processes. These processes can also sometimes work against us in, for example, eroding cultural artifacts, rock art, for example, or by speeding up the processes of coastal erosion. So we also look into ways of mediating, controlling, and predicting these sorts of unfortunate side of the subject as well. This degraded rock, the sediment, is moved around the landscape in lots of ways, which we investigate thoroughly within our cluster here. Wind-blown material moving through Namibia, measurements of turbulence and wind speed around some dunes in Namibia. The transport of this sediment is controlled by a whole variety of climatic and environmental factors. These factors change dramatically over time and space. The deposition of this material forms an archive that relates to the nature of the conditions during which it was transported and deposited. We investigate the properties of this material and we date it with great intensity to try and understand how these things have evolved over time. The transport of material can also take on epic proportions, as you've seen already from the dust work. Here's some nutrient-rich dust plumes blowing off the western coast of Africa, fertilising the biological activity in the Atlantic. We study the mechanisms and the processes responsible for these sorts of plumes. You've also already heard about the dustiest place on Earth, so I won't go into that in any more detail. Of course, dust isn't the only way in which landscapes interact with climate. We also study changes in albedo, the reflectivity of the surface, evaporation, distribution of plants, and also how plants respond to climate, so the whole sort of interaction. As residents of the Anthropocene, we're all acutely aware of these interactions between people and landscape. We have lots of projects looking at this interaction over different timescales in different places around the world, back into deep history of humanity, all the way into the present and projecting into the future. An example of that is this lovely work looking at tectonic, the geological controls on groundwater and this, the way that aquifers were used in Iran over 5,000 years ago, channeling this water for human use and the effect of tectonics on the ability to do that. We also look at urban landscapes, I'm glad to say. Some nice work going on looking at environmental conditions in Beijing. So that's it. I'll hand over to Sally. I hope you understand where our fascination with the landscapes comes from. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I think certainly the Landscape Dynamics cluster wins in terms of presenting the widest range of places in one talk. And also I think managing to cram 15 slides into 3 minutes I think is quite impressive. So we're going to finish off then, before we move to the Herbertson room for welcome refreshments, by looking at, in a bit more detail, at some of the work done in the Landscape Dynamics cluster. And Sally Burrow is going to take us to somewhere, again, a bit African, I think, perhaps a bit less dusty than where Ian Ashpole took us. But again, looking at, as Richard nicely put it, leaving very expensive bits of kit in beautiful environments. So, Sally, over to you.
Thanks, Heather. Okay, so I'm going to talk about deserts, megalakes, and ancient humans in Africa. So this is a screenshot from the Global Paleoclimate Database. It's where scientists like myself data dump what we know about past climates, about natural cycles, and about the response and the resilience of the environment to those climate changes. So you can see we get an A+ for North America and Northern Europe. There's lots of data and a pretty good consensus about what we understand about past climates. I work down, I don't know where the pointer bit is. I work down here in central southern Africa. There's much less data and no one can agree on what's gone on in the past at all. One of the things we do know very well about Africa is that there are times in the past when it's been much drier and times in the past when it's been much wetter. one of the reasons we think that is because we find these stories of crocodiles and hippos written on the rocks of deserts that are now extremely dry. And together with a raft of other evidence, it's one of the reasons we think that places like the Sahara may have once looked a little bit less like this and a little bit more like this. So why is that? How does that happen? When I was an undergraduate, this is the story I was told. So this is the explanation for it. There's a wobble in the Earth's orbit. We call it precession. And it amplifies or dampens a seasonal cycle in each hemisphere. And that in turn controls the behaviour of the African rainbelt. So 9,000 years ago, when we were drawing pictures of hippos on rocks in the Sahara, the summer temperatures in North Africa were a little bit warmer. And that increased heating of the land surface enhanced the North African monsoon, allowed it to push a bit further into the Sahara Desert. And so the sort of average position of the African rainbelt moved a bit further north. By extension, in that theory then, the average position of the African rainbelt has moved away from the southern subtropics. So what we should see is southern Africa getting drier when North Africa gets wetter, and vice versa. So this is what we call the asymmetry hypothesis. We should see asymmetry between the hemispheres. I became interested in this because I spend a lot of my time pottering around in a big dry lake basin in southern Africa. So this is the Kalahari. It's this big sandy basin in the centre of southern Africa. In it you'll find lots of elephants. You'll also find the Okavango Delta, which is fed from rain that falls up there in the Angolan highlands. At the end of the delta, you'll find these big dry sub-basins of what we think was once an extremely large paleolake. And that lake, at its greatest extent, was probably about 90,000 square kilometres, and that's bigger than the largest body of fresh water on Earth today. So not an insignificant lake in its time. And what we've done is to go to the shorelines of that lake and drill them and take samples which we can then date, and that tells us when those sediments were laid down, and so when that lake was there. We do that using a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, and you can find our laboratory at the bottom of the stairs in case you haven't seen us. We've also got a bright, shiny new sign. In this context, it's a pretty blunt tool, but it did tell us two important things. It told us, one, that that lake has come and gone many times, and two, that the last time that that lake was there was about 9,000 years ago, which slightly invalidates or is evidence against this asymmetry hypothesis. It's the same time that we're seeing this North African humid period. And we puzzled over this for quite a long time. And it's really only since we've been collaborating with some very clever climate modelers, particularly based in Reading, we've been able to try and unpick what's going on. And when you feed those climate models with that orbital precession cycle, what we find is we can reproduce those North African humid periods very nicely. What happens in southern Africa is a little bit more complicated. And for reasons that 7 minutes don't allow me to explain, the sort of oceanic configuration of the southern African landmass means that we get a much more heterogeneous pattern, a much more heterogeneous response. Which is interesting, and it's good. It means we can all stop arguing over who's right and who's wrong. It also explains why this big lake basin that I'm looking at, Paleolake Makadi, which is fed by the West African tropics, appears to be full at the same time that we get these wet periods in North Africa. So who cares about any of this? Well, archaeologists care. They're particularly interested in how the geography of those changing hydrological and ecological processes are impacting the way that humans used the landscape in the past. And whatever the humans were using the landscape for in Makadi, they seem to need some very large hand axes to do it. And perhaps we should all care a bit more, because these long records are really quite important in helping us to unpick how sensitive the landscape and the vegetation of Africa are to changes in rainfall. And so we're now moving from sand grains actually to leaf waxes to really try and refine the relationship between those two, between rainfall, vegetation and landscape change. And so I think with the appropriate sunset, that's it for me and Mega Lakes. I just want to say, actually I didn't put it up here, but none of this work that we've been doing is done in isolation, so I've got many colleagues and collaborators out there, so thanks very much for...
Excellent. So I'd like very quickly just to thank all our excellent speakers for being truly inspiring and sowing the seeds in us, for also sticking to time, for the people who've been recording this and filming it so unobtrusively, and in particular to Jerome, Ian, Catherine and all the other people who've organised it. So now I think the refreshments in the Herbertson room. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming.